I would like to say is that localization, as we're trying to promote it, is actually a systemic economic alternative. And so it isn't just, from our point of view, about acting at the local level. We would like to encourage any and every one of you who has any time whatsoever to try to make the world a better place, whether you're concerned about cruelty to animals, or poverty, or global warming, or plastic, or almost any social, environmental, psychological, or spiritual issue that you are concerned with, I am hoping that you will agree that the economic juggernaut is threatening us at every level, and we need to start creating a platform. We need a movement for economic change. And it's going to come from the bottom up. It's going to come from people like you. And I believe that the first step in that is the awareness raising, having a more holistic understanding of why we can all link hands instead of becoming more polarized. I believe that the Tea Party could get excited about this agenda if we could have a chance to reach them with this message. I see so many small farmers, small business people becoming angry at the environmental movement because they believe that they are the ones that have brought in all these regulations and things that have destroyed their businesses. So there's a tremendous polarization going on as a consequence of the concentration and completely wasteful, inefficient use of energy and resources that corporate globalization represents. So I'm very much hoping that you'll see education as activism as a very high priority. Many people think, well, the system will collapse. I'm afraid that ecosystems and people are collapsing, and that this artificial system, which just keeps running on by increasing the debt, adding a few more zeros to the debt, and let's keep going, may outlive us all. So let's really try to devote some of our time to articulate an alternative agenda. Let's be sure we have a clear yes as well as a no, that we have clarity about what we're for, what the yes is. And it is ultimately many yeses. That's what localization is about. It's about respecting diversity, about adapting our commerce, our commercial activity to the living cultures, ecosystems, and communities that this world exists of. So our great hope is that this film will help to strengthen what is already a global localization movement. And I can't tell you how positive it looks when you look at the local food movement in particular. You know, from Jakarta to Tokyo, Yokohama, when you see what happens when you start rebuilding the local food economy, it is so inspiring, and it gives you the absolute conviction that ultimately we human beings aren't so nasty and greedy after all. We actually prefer to cooperate, we prefer to be loving, and we prefer to work with nature instead of against her. So I really have a great faith in human beings and nature, and ultimately that's where the real power is. But I think, from my point of view, the main reason why we're in such a mess today, and why every government that I know of, even to a great extent the Bhutanese government, right now are still rolling out the red carpet for a disastrous path, is, I believe, is mainly ignorance. I believe there are too many people out there who actually believe that growth is needed to generate jobs, when the type of growth that's being constructed today is a job killer. So we really need to get that clear, that jobs and the environment actually need the same policy shift, the same U-turn. And I'm very excited to see that so many environmentalists who previously were concerned with forest destruction or particular environmental issues, all of which are vitally important and which we shouldn't abandon, but so many environmentalists are now turning to look at the need for a new economy. So there is a New Economy Network. There's an institute that used to be called the Schumacher Society that's changed its name to the New Economics Institute. There's all the wonderful work that David Corton has been doing that is setting that agenda for a new economy. And I wish we'd had David more in the film. We couldn't afford the filmmaker who was going to film you here for us. He was too expensive. But anyway, you saw that Andrew Sims is saying very similar things from the UK, Clive Hamilton from Australia, Vandana from India, and we actually had some fabulous people from China, from France, from many other countries. But unfortunately, the film was already getting a bit too long, and our editor said, cut, 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 so here we are. But you can see there's a chorus of voices from around the world. Please help to get that film out if you can. The website has hundreds of links to books, to reports, to other organizations. And if you start right here, involving yourselves with the localization movement from the ground up, you'll just feel and know of the joy and the benefits that comes from that. So it's a lot of fun, it's really positive, and I hope all of this can grow. Thank you very much.
And Helena, congratulations. That's just a fabulous, beautiful movie. And to me, in some ways, the most powerful message is the unspoken message. It's seeing the people, the faces of people who are acting and living in community. I mean, that kind of says it all. And the sense of the contrast between that and the artificial life of when we're caught up in cogs in the corporate machine and the consumerism. Now, the challenge for me here is that this is the first time I've seen the video also, and so I'm stretching here trying to figure out what can I add to this incredible message. And it covers just about every subject that I normally think and speak about. So I'm going to try to find some kind of organizing frameworks to help connect some of those dots. And, you know, I want to mention that much of my exploration and inquiry, I had the privilege of working with Helena. We were both members of the International Forum on Globalization during the time when we were formulating our shared analysis of what the this global economy was really about, and then coming together to find consensus in what is the alternative. And it all seems so obvious now. It was not so obvious and easy in terms of consensus at that point in time. But one way I think about it is, we're localizing, but it's a little bit deceptive because in the larger picture, what we're facing is a contest between two globalizations. One is the globalization of corporate power in the service of money. The other is a globalization of people power in service of life. And it's part of our rediscovery of who we are, what we are as living beings, and what is our connection to Earth. And a key piece of understanding what the transition is that we need to navigate, the turning from a world and economy ruled by global corporations to a world and economy that actualize the ultimate ideals of democracy, which is power residing in real people who also recognize and honor their place on Earth. And a thing that I've come to recognize is one way to think about the overall model is to think about the biosphere. That essentially the work that we're doing here in this economic localization is creating economies that mimic the structure and dynamics of Earth's biosphere, which is global, it is interconnected, but it is local everywhere. It's kind of a fractile structure. in which millions, trillions of living organisms, living beings, are interacting in what are ultimately fundamentally cooperative relationships to maximize the utilization of Earth's resources to maintain and sustain life. And it comes through this exquisite cooperative adaptation to Earth, to place, to the local, everywhere. And you see that even as you go below the soil, when we get into this organic agriculture, it is really about enlivening the soil rather than killing it with all of these chemicals. And some of the most fascinating aspects of biology are those real microsystems. Now, if we think of the larger context, we can think of, from a living systems perspective, we can think of the corporation as a cancer. That's the closest analog in life. A cancer sucks up the life energy of our body and turns it into these undifferentiated, totally unproductive cells that cannot maintain themselves. And corporations are doing that same thing with the living energy of people, community, and our natural systems, all in this incredible thing to turn it into money. And part of the trap we're in is getting caught up in the idea that money is wealth, and that when we're making money, we are creating wealth. When in fact our whole economy as it's currently designed is destroying life to make money. And the GDP goes up, and we think, hey, we're getting richer. When in fact, we're getting poorer. Now, how do we get from where we're at to where we need to go? I'm sure I'm not the only one in here who gets a little discouraged when we look at our national politics. Now, we got to deal with that larger political system. But if you want to look for hope, look in your community, look in your neighborhood, look at the kinds of things that are reported on in the film where people are in fact taking back control of their lives, the local resources, rebuilding their local food systems, rebuilding every aspect of their local economies and communities. And it's not just about the economic, because it is about building those relationships, those human caring relationships that are the ultimate source of all happiness and security. Now, the way I think about that strategy for change is threefold, three essential elements. One is changing the framing stories of the culture, the stories by which we understand who we are and what our possibilities are. Videos like this are an essential piece of that. Yes Magazine is about changing the story. The story is about what is our human nature. Is it really our human nature to be greedy and violent? Now, if you think about who are the people you admire, what is their nature? It is to be generous, to be loving. That is our true human nature. The other is a pathology. Question of what is wealth? What is the purpose of the economy? What is the purpose of the enterprise? All the framing stories that are most familiar are false. And through conversation, we can quickly recognize, understand that, and begin to bring through the true stories that become the foundation of rebuilding our economies. Second is create the new reality by growing it from the bottom up. And that, of course, is what is happening in all these communities that are rebuilding their local economies, their local caring relationships. And third is change the defining rules of the game, which really only comes after you've built the models, the political capacity, the political support to force our politicians to change the rules to support the new society, the new economy that we're building. Thank you.
It's great to be here. I had the opportunity a November ago, actually in November of 2009, I was invited to speak about Take Back Your Time and about the subject of time balance at the 5th International Gross National Happiness Conference at Iguazu Falls, Brazil. And Iguazu Falls, Brazil is a place to be where you can be quite happy. It's quite a beautiful place. But in talking about it, I had the opportunity to meet a number of people from around the world who were really trying to figure out what does make us happy and how can we make societies happier. And a number of those people, of course, came from Bhutan, where this began. From Bhutan, Scientists came and went and worked with the Center for Bhutan Studies and the Bhutanese government to create a series of surveys, ways of measuring happiness around 9 domains or 9 key dimensions of happiness, ranging from psychological well-being to health to time balance to social connection, education, good governance, ecological well-being, and so forth. And these surveys were created to really measure how well people were doing. Some of the people who created them included Ron Coleman from GPI Atlantic, who was in the film. I've met Ron at a number of conferences, and a fellow named Mike Pennock from Victoria, British Columbia. And so Victoria became the first city in North America actually to administer one of these surveys to its population, to create a happiness project in 2009. I learned about it in Brazil, and I got very excited about it, and met Michael Pennock, came back to Seattle, and in December, I happened to be at a holiday party, and I ran into the president of our city council, Richard Conlon, who just happens to have been the former publisher of Yes magazine. You've seen those kind of connections things. And you know, a holiday party is a really good place to convince one of your elected representatives that they should do something. And so I sat down, we got talking. Richard said, "What are you doing?" I told him about Brazil. He said, "That's interesting, and tell me more." And I said, "Well, Richard, I think we need to do what Victoria did. I think you need to bring Mike Pennock down to address the city council, and we've got to have a happiness project here and a happiness survey in Seattle." And Richard said, "I think we can do that." He told me later that when he proposed it to the city council, every eye in the room rolled. Gross national happiness. But after Mike Pennock came down from Victoria and addressed the council, people felt very differently. In June, we brought the Commissioner of Happiness, believe it or not. Bhutan has a Commissioner of Happiness. His name is Karma Chateem. We brought him from Bhutan here. He spoke at the Green Festival. He spoke to the City Council. He and I did a seminar for the EPA. He spoke at churches. Really, really wonderful guy. And we got this Seattle Area Happiness Initiative going. And that was taken up by Sustainable Seattle, a wonderful organization which is now celebrating its 20th anniversary. It's the first organization really in the world to do city indicators of well-being back in 1991. One of its founders just so happened to be Richard Conlon. But you know, there are all these little connections. So anyway, Sustainable Seattle got excited about this, and they decided, maybe we could make these indicators of happiness, these subjective indicators through one of these surveys, the model for our new iteration of indicators, our 5th iteration for the 20th anniversary of the organization. And that's what we're doing. And we've joined together Sustainable Seattle with the Compassionate Action Network, which grew out of the Dalai Lama's visit here some years ago, Take Back Your Time, and we are creating partnership with various organizations, including the City Council, but businesses, nonprofits, people around the city, various NGO organizations, around the happiness surveys, which we will then be administering. They're quite complex, but when you take it, you will learn a lot about yourself. And you can take it starting Friday, because it's going to be up at sustainableseattle.org/survey/GNH in caps /EN/. When you take those surveys, you will get an instant result. You will find out how well you're doing in each of these domains of happiness. But again, this is just not about personal things, and this tells us a lot about how well we are or are not doing as a society. So in Brazil, where these surveys are being administered, for example, a business called Natura, which is actually produces natural cosmetics from the rainforest and protecting the rainforest, administered this to its 8,000 employees. Now, Natura is a little bit of an unusual company. Its CEO was the vice presidential candidate for the Green Party in Brazil's recent election. But they administered the survey, and they found that the lowest score, a 30 out of 100, was in time balance. In fact, time balance is also the lowest score across the board in Victoria when Victoria did the survey. So what did the company do? They got the workers and people together, and they said, what can we do to give people more flexible hours, to give people more part-time work with benefits, to give people more vacation time, to figure out how we could work together, still be effective as a company, but in fact give people time balance in their life. And they're working with the city also to try to deal with some of the horrible commutes that Sao Paulo is famous for. We're going to combine the results of a scientific survey using this method with objective indicators that Sustainable Seattle has been working on over the years, and we're going to create a new scorecard, basically, for our city, and we think lots of other cities are going to join us. I just heard from Guadalajara, Mexico. They're interested. I heard from San Jose, California. They're interested. So we want you to join us. We want you to take the survey, and we want you to think about the kinds of things that are in it and how we can begin to change policy, how we can begin to change organizations, and how we can begin to change ourselves to build the kind of local economy, the local institutions that will give us these different results. Derek Bach, the former president of Harvard, has written a wonderful book called The Politics of Happiness, and he says, given that in the past 50 years, as Bill McKibben pointed out, we've seen no increase in happiness in the United States, does it make sense to keep on working such long hours and threatening the environment with disaster to keep doubling and redoubling the gross national product? Good question. Good question. This kind of growth, we can't grow on like this. We have got to change what we're doing. We're going to have a conference here in Seattle on happiness, my final words, in August, 26th to 28th at Seattle U. We're going to be bringing people from around the country and around the world. One of the people who will be speaking here is an Italian professor, Stefano Bartolini from the University of Siena. He has written an absolutely brilliant book called A Manifesto for Happiness, now a bestseller in Italian. It's not out in English yet, but I'm hoping it will be soon. This one takes on exactly the same issues that Helena does in her movie. It's a movement, it's developing. We need you to join us, and if you're interested in being part of the Seattle Area Happiness Campaign, let me know. You can contact me through Sustainable Seattle or KCTS, where I happen to work. We'll have a film on KCTS about this also coming out in February. Thank you very much.
Now I want to introduce Robert Jeffrey, Sr., who many of you know, a long-time passionate advocate for peace, justice, an economy that works in this area, was very active at the time of the WTO protests. Many of you remember him from that and many, many other contexts. Robert is the pastor at the New Hope Baptist Church in the Central District, and in 2001 became very ill, and the cause of his intestinal issues was eating too much processed food. And that woke him up to the fact that he and many others that he knows and lives near also eat too much processed food and don't have access to a lot of really great food. So that is one of the inspirations for some of the work that he's now doing under the large umbrella of the Black Dollar Days Task Force. Some of you may know about Clean Greens Farm and Market. Yes. Which I understand has now grown to 128 CSA members and going to launch 5 farm stands in Seattle come the farm season in the spring. So with that, let me turn this over to my good friend Robert.
I want to begin my remarks with the whole sense of community. I guess in a place like America, it's hard to define that. And I think that's where we are having problems. You know, how do we come together as community to begin to create levels of self-sufficiency or notions of self-sufficiency or even the beginnings of self-sufficiency? Because I think community means so many different things. I come from a place where you've got a lot of people who see community as gang members, who run in gangs. That's their community. I mean, it's just, we have been so pulverized by the PR campaigns of the Renton Group and the Burson Group and all of these other groups, these PR people, until I think it's very difficult for us to understand what real community is. And that's been our struggle. And I think that's the struggle that we have in this country, to create legitimate community, to create a legitimate, meaningful community that really comes together. Not a black community or a white community or whatever, but a community. And in some ways, that's what Clean Greens is about. The notion of trying to create that community by bringing different elements together, different facets together, and making them interdependent, one to the other. It's easy in small agrarian situations for the notion of community to flourish, but it's very difficult, especially in urban areas, as was seen through the film. I think that's the struggle that we have to really work on. We have to really work on that and work on the comfortability of seeing community as the people who look like us, who work with us. And that's a struggle I have. That's why I do a lot of work with gangs. I do a lot of work on the street. I do a lot of work in different areas that are very uncomfortable. And that's ultimately the struggle I had with going to the farm, because I came from an urban city setting, and being urban, it was very difficult for me to understand any connection at all I had at all with the land, and it was very difficult for me to get on my knees for the first time and dig in dirt. It was very difficult. It was traumatic. Probably because my ancestors, had come from slavery, and many of them were sharecroppers. And many of the people that I work with see it as traumatic. But for me, it was the trauma that made me understand that I was really involved in the creation of community. And I think that we can't, the globalization community understands who they are. They understand who their partners are. They understand who their friends are. They don't have color barriers. They will elect black people to do anything. They will elect red people to do anything. They will elect anybody they need to elect to do and carry out their agenda. They don't have these kinds of things. They have long since gave those up. This sense of hesitation, or this sense of almost horror that I felt when I was, really, really planting a seed, And I think that we have not. We still feel that we can fight them from the comfortable shelters of our own particular notions of what that community is, and we can't. So I guess that's one of the first things I want to say. Secondly, I think we have to fight. We have to fight. We have to fight back. We have to fight back for children in the inner cities who hate the earth, who have grown up on fast food and who have no knowledge of or no sense of the earth. We have to fight back for our own selves and our own sense of having made a contribution and having not just stood there. Martin Luther King said, "He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who perpetrates it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." And we are cooperating in many ways. In Clean Greens, we have food stands. We're not trying to be apart from the farmers markets, but we have food stands because we want to give individual community people opportunities in each community to collaborate with each other in those stands. And this year we will have immigrant stands, immigrant farmers who will participate. But I think everything that I want to say begins around the notion of the community and our struggle to create that on a local level. And as we create that local community, that kind of community that controls its food, controls its economy in terms of its own community foundations and its own community, even helping the school systems and those kinds of things to educate our kids, not replacing them as charter schools does, but helping them. We see the 50% dropout rate in Garfield as the 50% dropout rate in North Seattle. Until we do that, until we create that kind of community.
The issues around corporate power are fundamental, but there's a whole list of areas that I consider to be part of the rules, and one is the kind of issue that John's talking about with indicators. You know, instead of using financial indicators to measure the health of performance of the economy, use living system indicators, the health of our natural systems, our children, et cetera, our communities. Whole set of rules around the money system. You know, we used to have a system of community banks where communities had the capacity to create their own credit and in response to their own needs to fund real economic activity. The rules changed that allowed the banks to concentrate, and that whole system morphed into a Wall Street system that disempowers communities, not about funding the real economy, it's about sucking real wealth out of the economy. So there's a whole set of rules around that. All the rules that relate to progressive taxation, to social programs and so forth that move us toward an equitable sharing of real wealth. Rules that relate to ownership. Is ownership going to be absentee through public share trading, where there's a complete disconnect between the power of the enterprise and the ownership and any community interests, and root that back into real living owners? Anyhow, it's a very big agenda. That actually, my book, Agenda for a New Economy, lays this out in great detail of all these different areas.
I found the tone of this movie, I think a little optimistic, a little feel-good. I don't think we're going to have a choice as to whether or not to grow or not. Economic growth is over, as far as I can see, especially look at the oil situation. We're going to be facing a situation of forced economic decline within this coming decade. And I'd like to see you really address that in the movie.
Well, it's a longer discussion, but I do want to say, first of all, that in the sort of peak oil and sort of Western industrial world, in those movements, there is very much the sense that this system is going to collapse, we're going to have a steep decline, and so there isn't so much emphasis put on trying to mobilize people to change the direction of policies. I think there is a way in which an immediate shift towards re-regulating trade and finance could avert some of the disastrous effects that we may have if it continues. Another thing is that right now in India and China, the economy is growing like crazy. And it's a disaster. It's widening the gap between rich and poor. Housing in New Delhi costs more than it does in Seattle. I mean, the gap I've already been talking about this for 25 years. Already 20 years ago, the house prices in Bombay were higher in absolute terms than in the west of London or in New York City. So the gap is widening and violence is brewing. And what I'm trying to do with this film is to alert people to the need for a movement for economic change. I fear that governments together with the corporate and banking system could actually keep pushing growth for another few decades by cutting off mountaintops, by drilling wherever possible, gas fracking. Do you know about gas fracking?
Yes, we do.
Wherever you look, the enormous damage to the environment that's taking place because our political leaders across the board And I'm afraid even in Bhutan, even though there's a sector that is wanting to embrace the economics of happiness, the dominant trend is still pursuing the globalizing direction. The leaders in Bhutan still want to join the WTO. So I believe that with more awareness that this could be averted, that we can link together, and actually, if we're more economically literate, we could avoid even greater catastrophe. I also believe when you talk about those agricultural jobs not enabling us to buy fancy new cars and so on, I actually believe with minor policy change that we would find that the healthy, diversified food, the shelter, the clothing, the things we really need could actually be attained more easily than we think. And I really believe, I'm seeing in eco-villages and in communities a higher quality of life than I am in the sort of, supposedly affluent middle classes. So I have a slightly different perspective from yours.
I certainly agree with Helena that I honestly believe that we have to have a message that's positive. The gloom and doom message and the message that the world is going to collapse tomorrow, as accurate as it may be, is not going to work. And I'm sorry, but that I am convinced that we have to have a message that makes people feel that they can have a future that's positive. And that's the Happiness Initiative that I'm working on is not about pie in the sky, and it's not Mary Poppins and such. It's actually about good hard surveys and facts to find out where people are hurting in this city and what we can do about it.
The world, from a great majority of people in this country, has already collapsed.
That's right.
And I think that the notion that's the end is not a correct notion.
Yeah.
I mean, because there are people who are already living at the bottom and recreating life at the bottom. And I grew up in a family of 16 children, and that's as bottom as you can get. My dad made about $50 a week, but we created life, and we were happy. And I think that I just wanted to point that out, that having a BMW is not necessarily what it's all about. It's about maintaining existence, maintaining life, maintaining community, maintaining ourselves, and maintaining the earth, and maintaining the future for our children and our grandchildren, and maintaining us as human beings. To me, that's what it's about.
I just want to add one sentence. The thing that guides my thinking is that the same actions that are required to avoid collapse are the same actions we need to be taking to survive after collapse.
Exactly.
So where we think the collapse is going to come is basically irrelevant. We just do everything we can to do what Helen is outlining for us.
I'm interested in your observations of permaculture as you've traveled the world.
Thank you. Very, very good question from my point of view, because I've been quite involved with the permaculture movement, which has also informed and gave rise to the global eco-village network, of which I've been a part since it started. So I've been quite close to the permaculture movement, and I knew Bill Mollison personally and used to see him. And I think it's a very important movement and a very powerful movement. However, I would like very much to see an added dimension there, which would be the economic component. In a sense, I would like permaculturists also to be more deeply informed about the global south in order to be a stronger voice for diversified, greater, I was going to say, rather than self-reliance, maybe we should change the word to community sufficiency. Community sufficiency rather than self-sufficiency. Community reliance, also in terms of our organization for food growing. But so I would like permaculture to add that dimension of greater economic literacy, a little bit of time to also educate, or if you want, inform and reach out beyond their own enclaves. If you see what I mean, so in my organization, we have seen education as activism for a long time, because we've ended up working in both the global north and the global south, and we found that there are myths on both sides of the divide. You know, we address myths. You know, in the global south, there is this belief that our world is one, you know, where the streets are paved with gold, and above all, what I came to understand, you know, because I spoke the language fluently in Ladakh, and I also worked in Bhutan over a 5-year period, and in many other cultures. My book, Ancient Futures, and the film have been translated into almost 50 languages, so we've had a lot of contact with other cultures. So what I found in non-Western cultures was not only a romanticized, completely unrealistic belief about life in the West, but most importantly, I found that that led to a deep sense of inferiority, that people who had had deep self-esteem suddenly saw themselves as inferior, backward, stupid. And so the psychology of development is something that we all need to understand better, so that as permaculturists, if we work in the global south, which I believe we need to do, because we need to link up and support this shift, we need to be much more conscious of communicating the realities of life in the West. And in the global north, I believe that if we understood the global south better, we wouldn't be quite as pessimistic either as this gentleman earlier. We would see more examples of how local economies that are very basic can actually provide a very rich and vibrant culture, and, you know, where everyone joins in singing and dancing and theater making and poetry. There's a rich, rich culture that can thrive even on the soil of a relatively, you know, limited economy. It's not so obviously available in many places anymore, but still. So basically, of permaculture, I would ask more economic literacy, a greater attention to communicating what permaculture is about. More films, more books, more getting the message out to build up a stronger movement. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I have noted a parallel in our panel and many of others of the modern green society. They do not acknowledge the reality that we in the West have to reduce our consumption and cut back our standard of living. 5% of the world's population cannot continue to consume 25 or 30% of the world's resources. I haven't heard anybody on the panel address that, so why not?
Yeah, we've been doing that very, very consistently. My book, Affluenza, my film, it says it very consistently. We say that every time we give a talk about the Happiness Project. We've got to turn this around, go the other direction. We can't grow on like this. Absolutely, you're right. But we say it all the time, so maybe the fact that we didn't say it on this panel is because you've heard it so often from us. Thanks.
But we said it in the film. I feel we said it in the film very clearly. Yeah.
I understand that the localization, the merits and the value of that, and the happiness factor. But how do you convince the other side that, because we know we talk about corporations and the tug of war of this, but they're people too.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people working on that side. My sense is that we're probably not going to convince them with arguments. The basic strategy of rebuilding our local economies is what we call an emergence and displacement strategy. And it really is, as we rebuild these local systems, it gives all of us more options as to where we shop, where we work, where we invest. And each time we shift it's shifting our life energy, withdrawing that life energy from support of the corporate system to redirecting it to support of the local system. My friend Tom Hartman calls it walking away from the king and recognizing that the only power the king has, which in this case would be the corporations, is the power that we yield to them as individuals. And if enough of us withhold that power to support this new system, this new economy, we do not necessarily have to wait for their acquiescence. Now, at the same time, there's a lot of evidence, a lot of those folks are also very unhappy. And, you know, become a friend, Jim Wallace, from the the progressive evangelical movement, says he's actually been approached by a lot of corporate executives who are kind of approaching him as a confessor and saying, you know, I'm feeling a real tension between the values embodied in my corporation and what I'm required to do as a corporate CEO and my real values. So, well, we'll see how that plays out.
I think what we're doing is leveraging power. We're leveraging corporations into sanity. And what we, for example, when we start selling organic grains in the central area for 70 cents a bunch, and we were giving people 16 and 17 leaves in a bunch, Safeway went down to 50 cents a bunch. The thing is we're leveraging sanity, and the more we leverage sanity, the more we educate. You know, I think Helen said it, they're ignorant. I have problems with that. I think they're just greedy pigs.
I actually, what I believe is that within the corporations, there are a lot of people. Don't forget, I mean, what do we mean when we say the corporation? It's a giant empire. I mean, Coca-Cola employs millions of people, and among them are people who are every bit as nice and good as we are. Absolutely, I think without a doubt. And everybody who's a CEO in the world is not a greedy pig. That's not my experience. But what I think David describes in his book is that as a structure, these corporations become a cancer. So as a structure, I think we can't blame them enough for being greedy pigs. I mean, they are more than greedy pigs. They're cancerous monsters. But it's mainly because of the blindness that they generate and that they feed on. And they now, in turn, as giant empires, are investing millions and billions, as we know, to steer us off the course. I don't have time to go into all of this, but I have witnessed personally in many instances how corporate CEOs or leaders in business have helped to undermine the environmental movement. And they're now very busily trying to go local. I mean, the world's biggest bank claims to be local. They know that it's a big threat, and we have got to be more economically literate so that we don't fall for it. Because when Walmart and even Safeway pretends to be organic and local, all they're doing is changing the language to cover something that is diametrically opposed to what we need and what we want. We need smaller scale enterprise to have enterprise and business be compatible with democracy, with diversity, with community, and with happiness. So small scale is fundamental.
As a business person, I'm hit with the three monsters, which actually feels like 5 or 6. That's Department of Licensing, Department of Revenue, and the insurance companies, making me raise up not only what I need to charge people to help people grow food, and provide other challenges to providing good work and good employment for people, but it also makes me work a lot more to cover those things.
Helena, I want to give you the last word here because this is the close of our panel.
Well, I would say, first of all, if you heard the gentleman who was here talking about the local investment initiative they started in their community. You know, once we start doing things collectively, we could actually start creating funds to help keep rents lower or even subsidize the rent of people in our areas. However, I believe we need to start doing things like that to support each other and to support. I was mentioning tonight at dinner that the only city I know of really in the world right now where the rents aren't skyrocketing, mortgages are, and house prices are absolutely skyrocketing. In New Delhi, as I mentioned earlier, it's more expensive than here. The only city I know where that isn't so bad yet is Berlin. They've had a rent control legislation that's still in place, to my knowledge. It may be changing because the corporate juggernaut is dismantling almost everything right now. But anyway, there are things we can do collectively. As individuals, don't be too hard on yourself. If you have to go out there and earn money to pay your rent, you need to do that now. But remember that everything we do to start rebuilding that local support system through investment, through local food and so on, will start helping to create a different economy. But we also, that's why I'm saying we also need to be lobbying for policy change. From my point of view, the first step would be for us to be alert enough to understand that the deregulation of global trade and finance, which is still continuing, the financial deregulation and the trade deregulation are completely linked. We've been fooled into believing that it's only in the trade in toxic debt that we have such a serious problem. Or we have a trade in toxic waste, or we have a trade in water and milk and animals, as we show, being imported and exported. And that is what's destroying the small, sustainable businesses, affordable prices for food and rent and all the things we need. So the first step we need is for people to be alert to preventing further deregulation. That's no longer happening under the auspices of the WTO. It's happening primarily through bilateral treaties. So we need to come back to that basic economic literacy. We don't have to read the treaties. We don't have to understand them. Almost no one does. Most of the senators and congressmen and so on who are in favor of these things have no clue what they're voting in favor of. They just believe that this is about growth and that this growth is necessary. So in terms of the changes that we need to start lobbying for, the first one is preventing further deregulation. And that is a relatively incremental step. I don't think it would be that difficult to get people to understand that. We just spell out a few more times about the fact that this system means that our taxes are paying million-dollar bonuses to fat cats. People are fed up with that. We can get right and left coalitions to prevent that further erosion of our lives, our democracy. Don't believe the myth. We're told again and again that, oh, these American middle-class people, they don't want to sacrifice their lifestyle. That's why they're not doing anything about this. Well, if they don't want to sacrifice their lifestyle, they better do something, because the money is going out of this country very, very quickly. And don't believe, you know, Vandana is very clear in the film, don't believe the corporate myth that the money going over there is helping people in India, Africa, or China. It's helping to create billionaires at a rate that's unbelievable. The richest man in the world is a Mexican, $54 billion. That's where the money is going, into this very, very top-heavy system. So, yeah, I'm talking too much, but I really believe that there could be a very powerful movement relatively quickly if more people would be willing to think a little bit more about the economy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Helena.